All right, so Washington Irving's The Devil and Tom Walker. And really, guys, I struggled with what story I wanted us to read from Washington Irving because there's so many of them and they're all good. Went back and forth between Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but I decided on The Devil and Tom Walker because I thought that it paired well with our other story of focus this week, which is Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. But The Devil and Tom Walker is modeled after a work of folklore. And that's interesting. I mean, all most of Washington Irving's tales are modeled after legends or kind of tall tales or folk stories. But I think it's interesting because it really plays on the origins of this short story. So, The Devil and Tom Walker was first published in 1824 as part of Irving's Tales of a Traveler. It's found in part 4 of the book, also known as the Money Diggers series. And in this tale, Gentleman Geoffrey Crayon, a fictional character created by the author, narrates the tale. And although the narrator never tells us his name, he does note that the story has been a legend of the New England area for roughly 100 years. Tales of a Traveler was not very successful, but many critics blame this on the fact that the short story was a new form of writing at the time. And despite the book's negative reception, The Devil and Tom Walker is one of the stories for which Irving is most well known. It's commonly referred to as the New England Faust, and it can be assumed that Irving based this story on Goethe's Faust, or if you're English, Marlowe's translation of it in The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. And in the Faustus story, it's about a man who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and privileges that are not granted to normal people. Irving, however, instills his tale with moral ideals common to New England in the 19th century. And the lesson of Tom Walker's ruin illustrates the sorrow that would befall unscrupulous sinners. So, this is really kind of a tale of a man who sells his soul and ultimately receives nothing. And what's interesting about kind of Irving's tale and is that he really kind of takes this German or English translation of a tale and instills in it the moral beliefs and values of not just the 19th century but 19th century America, where he appeals to the roots of a young nation, in which he sets the tale in the Boston, New England area. He focuses on this westward expansion, the relationship with Native Americans, and instills in it or infuses in it this concept of American romanticism, which we'll talk about in just a second. To give you guys a little bit of historical context, when this story was written, the U.S. was a new and growing country that was populated by various groups of European immigrants. And a uniquely American culture slowly formed as the traditions of many different groups merged and new traditions brought on by circumstances emerged. And Irving and his contemporaries wrote about the concepts of freedom, religious piety, and independence that characterized the United States or the country that had just been born. When the story was written, Andrew Jackson, I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he was elected president, and he was known for his efforts to displace many Native American tribes, causing their widespread starvation and death. However, new arrivals to the country were uplifted by America's perceived spirits of romanticism and humanitarianism. And Irving really embraced this feeling of romanticism in his writing. when he talks about descriptive passages about landscapes and relating the stories of hardworking immigrants who carved out a good living for their families. And I do want to take just a second to make a note about American Romanticism, which is very different than British Romanticism. It is a movement that is associated with the values of feeling and intuition over reason, which is kind of quintessential Romanticism, no matter which way you look at it. And this movement really stems from the goals of the 18th century, which were independence, prosperity, and commerce. And cities and towns were turned into cities, and they were considered to be places of success and opportunity. And with the growth of cities, there was this kind of squalid, there were squalid conditions associated with industrialism, and the Romantics sought to escape that current landscape and go back to a time of yesteryear or nostalgia where things were more simpler or more simpler or simpler more simpler. They longed for simplicity of the days gone by. And I can hear you asking yourself, Miss Swan, how is the story about a man who sells his soul to the devil romantic? And remember last week when we were talking about Bisclaveret, romance is not necessarily associated with love and hearts and flowers and all of that, but it's more about adventure. And the stories of Washington Irving and other of his contemporaries were romantic tales that were that showcased the adventures of common men, not these, knightly, kingly people, but common men that often conclude with strong morals outlining Puritan ideals of good and evil. And those Puritan ideals are quintessential to American Romanticism. The Devil in Tom Walker, in which Tom Walker is a corrupt individual, he gets his comeuppance at the end, which kind of typifies the literature of this era. Another note about the style of this story, it's an allegory. Both stories we're reading this week are allegories, and most folk tales, like this one is modeled to be, are allegories in which characters and actions are symbolic of larger conditions of human nature. For example, we have Old Scratch, who personifies evil or temptation. We have the murky woods full of quagmires in which Tom meets the devil that are symbolic of his consciousness, which, clouded by his greed, falls easily to the devil's temptation. And then, of course, we have Tom Walker himself, who is an unscrupulous moneylender, makes a pact with the devil, and only later professes religious beliefs through these actions. And Tom really represents religious hypocrisy, and Irving shows that will be punished. So I want you guys to pay attention to this idea that this story is allegorical, but there's both a literal and figurative meaning in everything. Everything is symbolic. Added to the type of work this is, I want you guys to focus on the point of view where we have this third person narrator, Geoffrey Crayon, like I was mentioning earlier, who is a fictional character. It's a persona created by Irving who appears in a number of his works. But the story's status of legend or tall tale is enhanced by the narrator's comments and the fact that he places the year it takes place as 1727, almost 100 years before the date he's writing. And through this secondhand narration, Irving shows that the tale has a long local history, a primary characteristic of a folk tale. And such first person narration adds to the feeling the reader has of it being told, a story in the oral tradition. So this really, like I said, emphasizes some of the origins of the short story. But not only that, it gives us a sense of, he plays on these folk tales or these legends and puts them in um, American kind of settings, which I think is kind of cool. So I also want you guys to focus on the setting of our story. It takes place in New England. And part of this is because Irving he sought to spearhead the establishment of literature that was uniquely American. And to that end, he sets The Devil and Tom Walker in the New England area near Boston. In the early 18th century, this was one of the largest and most established metropolitan areas in the growing United States. And as such, Irving describes the landscapes of bluffs and swamps that were familiar to the area's inhabitants and made the site of Tom's meeting with the devil, an old Indian fort that had been a stronghold during the war with Europeans, providing another uniquely American context. And it's not coincidental that he places this story in New England for the reasons I just described, but it also highlights Irving's interest in Tom's morality. If you guys know, I'm sure that in years past, the New England area was populated by Puritans, Quakers, and Anabaptists, all strict Christian orders that were highly concerned with members' moral consciousness. So we have in this story the murky morass in which Tom meets Old Scratch, which is symbolic of Tom's character. And through this setting, Irving really suggests that if one's heart is full of mud and quicksand, one is likely to encounter and succumb to temptation. So some themes to be on the lookout for as you read this story. Look for themes of greed, hypocrisy, and moral corruption. I hope you guys really enjoy The Devil and Tom Walker. I do. And I'm interested to see what you guys think of this story, but not only that, how you think it compares to the other story that we're going to read, which I'm going to talk about in the next video.